These are notes on why mealworm protein is better for the environment than cow protein if you are choosing to eat meat as part of your diet. So first I'm going to give you a number of figures on why or cow protein is so bad for the environment. And so consider this a picture of a cheeseburger and the environment. So first of all, raising livestock is responsible for about 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions per year in the world. And so a lot of us talk about, like, I really care about the environment, and so I make sure that I turn off my lights when I'm not using them. Or I make sure that I have LED lights in my house instead of conventional lights because they use less energy. And those are all great things. But really, if you're looking at the top 3 things you could do to protect the environment, the top one is reducing your driving. Obviously, just staying out of your car more, walking more places, biking, carpooling, taking buses, that kind of thing. And then also flying less. Flying actually takes an incredible amount of fuel, puts out a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But then eating less meat is actually in that top 3 there. And I don't remember if it's second or third. You can look that up. But raising livestock to eat is responsible for 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really nice if you are turning off your light as you go to cook your steak, but it's much better to cut back on the amount of livestock you're eating each year and leave your light on, although it's probably better to do both. So, but just keep that in mind, that shifting a couple of meals per week to be vegetarian compared to meat-based is actually going to do a lot for the environment. So the average cow releases the same amount of greenhouse gases in 1 year as burning 200 gallons of gas. So if you figure that the average car, say, fills up, say, has a 15-gallon tank, then that means that would be 13 fill-ups. So you can kind of decide. Some people, depending on their commute, may fill up their tank every week. Some people may do every other week. I drive so little that I tend to do every 3 weeks. So it's going to depend on how much gas. But let's say on average people tend to fill up every 2 weeks. So then that means that 13 fill-ups times 2, because it would be every 2 weeks, that would be about 26 weeks, which is exactly half a year. Meaning that one cow releases the same amount of greenhouse gases in 1 year as half the gas you use in a year. Or 2 cows would release the same amount of greenhouse gases as all the gas you use in an entire year in your car. And that gas is both carbon dioxide and methane. So the cows themselves release a lot of methane in their cow farts. That farting is methane gas, and cows fart a lot. Depending on what the cows are eating, they may actually produce more or less methane. And then the carbon dioxide, most of that doesn't come from the cow itself, although certainly the cow is undergoing cellular respiration and so letting off carbon dioxide, but a lot of it actually comes from the processing of the cow and from the growing of the food and stuff like that. So one cow provides about 500 pounds of meat, which sounds like a lot, right? But if you consider the average family might eat, if you're having hamburgers for dinner or steak for dinner, say 2 pounds of meat, then that's 250 families that can be fed on one cow. But when you start to think about, the 300 million people we have in the United States, that's not a ton of meat compared to how much energy goes in. It takes 1,800 gallons of water for 1 pound of beef. So if you look at that, it provides 500 pounds of meat, and then you go 500 times 1,800. That's 900,000 gallons of water to raise that cow. Okay, and then again, go back to thinking about all of the people in the world who don't have access to clean water, right? That 900,000 gallons would go a lot more efficiently to people who need the water than to raise the beef that's going to feed, 250 people. If we're looking at one cow, the 1,800 gallons of water would just go for 1 pound of beef. And as I said, I would say the average family of 4, if you're having hamburgers or steak, that might be like 2 pounds of beef. Rainforest clearing. So we actually have to clear a lot of land, both for cows to graze, but also to grow whatever food the cows need. And so we're getting rid of a lot of our rainforest to do that. Trees, as we're going to learn in our unit on plants, take in a net amount of carbon dioxide. So they remove carbon dioxide from the air, which is great. They're one of the only natural sources we have, the ocean being a second one. But that's got its own issues associated with it, but trees are really the only natural thing we have that takes carbon dioxide out of the air. And they can't do it as fast as we're putting carbon dioxide in the air, which is why we have an increase in carbon dioxide. But certainly if we're cutting them down, then they can do it even less. And so that makes that balance even, or that imbalance even greater. There's also, some of you know, like a lot of medicines that are found in the rainforest, just because so much of it is undiscovered, that, we're losing resources that we don't even know that we need yet. It takes about 10 pounds of feed to raise 1 pound of beef. So that goes along with the 1,800 gallons of water for a pound of beef. It also takes about 10 pounds of feed. That feed, though, is all plant matter, right? We looked at this with the trophic pyramid, and now we understand that that makes sense, right? Because you lose about 90% of the energy, so it would take 10 pounds of feed for 1 pound of beef. But again, this is feed that people could be eating. So, whereas a couple people might sit down to a pound of beef, you could feed a lot more than a couple people on the 10 pounds of corn or the 10 pounds of whatever grain you're feeding the cow. Hopefully you're getting cows that are eating grain. And so there again we see, a lot of resources that people could use a lot more efficiently going for a little bit of meat. And then there's also a big issue with antibiotic resistance. A lot of you have heard that, some of our bacterial infections are becoming immune to antibiotics. So one of the giant microbes in our classroom is one called MRSA, which is a antibiotic resistant strain of Staphylococcus, which is a bacteria that's found just all over the place, like probably on desks in my room, perhaps. At any rate, if we don't have the antibiotics to fight them, then people can either die of these infections or, have to go through other things. So, for example, our favorite Miss Colleton contracted MRSA at one point, and they literally had to cut it out of her because there were no antibiotics to clear that up. Now, some of that antibiotic resistance comes from evolution of bacteria due to humans taking too many antibiotics. So that's why humans are told not to take antibiotics if they don't need them. So like if you have a viral infection like a cold, you shouldn't be taking antibiotics. Humans are told not to use antibacterial soap. Just use regular soap and water because the antibacterial soap leads to evolution of resistant bacteria. And we're going to look at this in more detail when we get to the evolution unit. But another huge issue is because our livestock, for the most part, is raised in such close proximity, it has a higher chance of getting sick. So ranchers will preventatively use antibiotics on their livestock simply to prevent anything from getting sick, whether they need them or not. And that also leads to a lot of antibiotic resistance, which then comes back and harms us when we are inflicted with the same bacteria and don't have the antibiotics. So lots and lots of reasons to cut down on your consumption, especially of beef. Chickens and pigs to a smaller extent, fish to an even smaller extent. So like with fish, there's about a 1-to-1 ratio of feed to fish. And so it's not such an imbalance. Fish also don't give off as many greenhouse gases as they're growing, things like that. I'm not suggesting that you all go home and become vegetarian, but I think it is worth, especially those of us who say we do care about the environment, to consider, like, if we have meat every night at dinner, could we cut that back to 5 out of 7 nights or 4 out of 7 nights? Is that something that would be reasonable? And then pesticides and fertilizers are the last thing, and that goes back to what we need to put on our crops in order to grow the feed for our livestock, right? So we need a lot of pesticides, we need a lot of fertilizers. Those then go into the water table and pollute the environment, that being our drinking water and our soil. And as you read Omnivore's Dilemma, you're going to see more and more of these kind of applications. So let's look at a trophic pyramid that's a little different than what we've looked at before, because this trophic pyramid over here has the decomposers added, and we haven't looked at decomposers. Decomposers are a category of living organism. They could be fungi, they could be bacterial, they could be animal. So mealworms happen to be decomposers. And what decomposers do is they eat from any level of the trophic pyramid. So they're really kind of nature's cleaner-uppers. Okay, they're not just eating from the levels below them per se, because there is no below them. They will decompose a squid and they'll decompose phytoplankton or seaweed. This is obviously a aquatic pyramid, but this works for terrestrial organisms as well. And what decomposers do is they eat from all levels, and then they let's not worry about energy so much right now, but they recycle nutrients to the bottom. So again, as we learn more and more about plants, you're going to see that, for example, in order for anything to get protein, plants need to synthesize that protein. So any protein you have in you originally started as plant protein. But in order to do that, plants need nitrogen. Well, plants don't get nitrogen from photosynthesis, so they have to get it some other way. They get it from nitrogen they absorb based on decomposers breaking down the nitrogen that is in the air, for example, into a form that plants can then use. So decomposers have a really important part in the ecosystem as a whole, but even more important, because they eat off of any level, they're incredibly efficient with what they're eating. Because it's not that they're losing a bunch of energy because they're only eating up here, right? They're eating off of anything. So like mealworms, they can eat plants, but they can also eat animal stuff. So that makes them really efficient eaters. And so to raise mealworms, and mealworms are raised, that's kind of a funny thing to think about, but like the mealworms I bought at Petco, you know, nobody went out and collected those mealworms. They were raised in, I don't know, factory somewhere, right? They don't need as many resources to keep them alive. They're not needing all of the water. They're not needing as much of the feed. They don't give off, clearly they do give off carbon dioxide. We saw that, but it's not as much. And so you're getting that same animal protein. It is actually the exact same protein, but in a much more environmentally friendly package. And you're going to start to see, as our world grows and gets towards, 8 and 9 billion people, you're going to start to see more insect protein in things, because there's no way that the earth can sustain the number of people it's going to have if we're all eating larger animals like pigs, like cows, like chickens. It's just not possible for us to grow that many to feed 9 billion people who are going to want those kinds of things, right? We're kind of like, well, not everybody in the world eats cow. That's true, and for some it's a cultural thing, but for others it's simply a resource and money thing. But as other places in the world get more resources, they're going to want what we expect to have, right? We expect to have hamburger at the store when we want it. Why shouldn't other people expect to have that? Well, the earth can't sustain it. So you're going to see more and more insect protein. Probably not in like shrink wrapped packages in the store that you then go home and fry up, but in things like last year, a student brought me a bag of cricket chips. So they were barbecue flavored corn chips, and each one had full ground up. So ground, it's meal, you can't see it, cricket in it, and that conveyed protein within the chips. So that's where you're going to start seeing it, as we need protein to sustain meat eaters around the world. All right, so that is a very long-winded way of explaining why it's so important that we use our mealworms in this way and enjoy our mealworm brownies. Have a good night.